The low, rolling hills of eastern Kentucky concealed more than coal seams and timber at the turn of the 20th century. In the first years of the 1900s, those hills held secrets pressed deep into the fog-choked hollows of Appalachia, in a place locals barely spoke of. A settlement known as Blackwood Hollow. A place so remote it could only be reached by a single dirt road that twisted through the forest and vanished entirely after heavy rain, leaving the hollow effectively sealed from the outside world. Tucked within that isolation lived a community of just 12 families. They existed almost entirely beyond the reach of modern society. No telegraph. No regular visitors. No oversight. And they were not, as outsiders might assume, simply reclusive mountain folk clinging to old ways. Blackwood Hollow was something far darker. Something deliberate. The settlement had been founded in 1873 by a man named Ezekiel Blackwood. A former Civil War field medic, Blackwood possessed fragments of medical knowledge, just enough to be dangerous. Over time, those fragments hardened into beliefs that would later horrify physicians, historians, and ethicists alike. Blackwood became convinced that what he called familial purity could be engineered. That human strength, intelligence, and resilience could be intensified by keeping bloodlines closed rather than branching outward. At the core of his doctrine was a practice he referred to as blood harmony. Before conception, siblings were required to participate in ritualized exchanges of bodily fluids, small, deliberate incisions cut into their palms, pressed together so blood could mingle. To Blackwood and his followers, this act symbolized the strengthening of shared essence. They believed it concentrated power within the family line, binding traits tighter with each generation. The full scope of this philosophy would remain hidden for decades. It was not until 1967 that a deteriorating wooden chest was discovered in the ruins of the settlement. Inside were journals, ledgers, and handwritten manifestos that laid bare the logic behind what later became known as the Blackwood experiment. Blackwood had written extensively, outlining theories that predated any real scientific understanding of heredity. Chromosomes, recessive traits, genetic mutation, none of these concepts existed in his vocabulary. Instead, he relied on analogy and conviction. The strength of the oak comes from its singular seed, he wrote. Our family trees must not reach outward, but fold inward, returning again and again to their source. Only then may power be concentrated in the blood. Under these principles, the community operated with rigid rules. Marriage between first cousins was considered the minimum acceptable standard. Pairings between siblings were elevated to ceremonial events. During these rites, an elder, often Blackwood himself, would perform the blood incisions using a polished silver blade. Hands were pressed together. Chants were spoken. The act was framed as sacred preparation for conception. Children born of these unions were expected to embody superiority. By 1909, Blackwood Hollow had grown to 73 residents. On the surface, it appeared stable. But the human cost of such isolation was written plainly on the bodies of its people. Distinctive facial asymmetry. Unusual gaits. Misshapen joints. Cognitive impairments that contradicted every promise of advancement the doctrine proclaimed. Yet belief persisted. Any child born with severe or obvious deformities was removed from the main settlement and housed in a separate structure known as the waiting house. There, they lived apart, kept alive, fed, and treated with a strange reverence, as though their suffering carried spiritual meaning. The outside world might never have learned of Blackwood Hollow if not for chance. In April of 1909, a traveling preacher named Reverend Thomas Harlow took a wrong turn while navigating the mountain roads. His journal, now preserved by the Kentucky Historical Society, records what he encountered. I came upon them during what appeared to be a ceremony, Harlow wrote. A young man and woman stood before the gathered crowd. Their features were so alike they could only have been brother and sister. An elderly man cut their hands with a silver instrument. I watched as they pressed bleeding palms together while the others chanted words of purification and strength. Harlow did not confront them. He fled the hollow without being seen and made his way to Pine Ridge, where he reported what he had witnessed. The account troubled local authorities enough that Sheriff James Mallister assembled a small group of deputies to investigate. What they found on May 3, 1909, would later be cited as one of the earliest documented cases of organized familial intermarriage in American medical history. The sheriff's party entered Blackwood Hollow on a gray, mist-heavy morning. Fog clung to the pines like torn gauze, blurring the edges of the world. What awaited them was not a ramshackle camp, but an orderly settlement. Cabins constructed with care. Paths swept clean. Buildings arranged in a near-perfect circle around a central meeting house. But it was the people themselves that immediately drew Mallister's attention. In his official report to the governor dated May 7, he described the inhabitants as sharing peculiar physical traits, closely set eyes, enlarged foreheads, and unusual gait patterns. Most unsettling was their resemblance to one another. Despite claims of separate family units, many appeared nearly identical, as if the same face had been replicated across generations. The community welcomed the deputies, mistaking them for traders or travelers. This allowed law enforcement to move freely and observe without resistance. The contrast was stark. The settlement was clean, orderly. Yet the children showed clear signs of distress. Some no older than 5 struggled to speak in complete sentences. Others moved with difficulty, their limbs stiff or misshapen. And then there was the waiting house. Deputy Franklin's supplemental report described what lay inside: 7 individuals with profound deformities, separated from the rest of the community but treated with unsettling reverence, as if their suffering marked them as spiritually elevated rather than tragically afflicted. At the center of it all stood Ezekiel Blackwood. Now 76 years old, he was regarded not merely as a leader, but as a visionary. He maintained meticulous ledgers cataloging every pairing, every ritual, every child. Measurements were recorded. Head sizes. Limb lengths. Observations of behavior and intelligence. When these records were later studied by physicians from Johns Hopkins University, they would describe them as chilling. Dr. William Crawford wrote in 1912, "These documents represent one of the most disturbing systematic attempts at human breeding in modern history." Blackwood believed himself a scientist. And the experiment, in his mind, was far from finished. By the time authorities fully grasped what was unfolding inside Blackwood Hollow, the damage had already been done. Decades of enforced isolation and controlled pairings had shaped not only the bodies of its residents, but their worldview. To Ezekiel Blackwood, none of what the sheriff observed represented failure. It was progress, evidence, he believed, that his work was refining humanity rather than destroying it. When Sheriff Mallister questioned him directly, Blackwood showed neither fear nor shame. Instead, he ushered the lawmen into the central meeting house and laid out what he proudly called his life's achievement. Spread across a long wooden table was a massive hand-drawn family tree, its branches looping inward again and again. 5 generations of calculated unions. Names repeated. Lines converging where they should have diverged. This document, meant as proof of success, would later become the foundation of the prosecution's case. Mallister later testified that even when confronted with children who could barely walk or speak, Blackwood's certainty never wavered. He spoke of temporary imperfections, of purification cycles not yet complete, of sacrifices necessary for future greatness. What followed exposed the limits of belief when confronted by authority. On May 8, 1909, Sheriff Mallister returned to the Hollow with reinforcements. This time, he was accompanied by Judge William Harrington and 2 physicians tasked with evaluating the settlement's children. The mission was no longer observation, it was intervention. Officials now understood Blackwood Hollow as both a public health emergency and a criminal operation disguised beneath ritual and faith. Tensions escalated almost immediately. When deputies attempted to remove several children for medical examination, members of the community reacted with panic and fury. They believed the outside world had come to corrupt their blood, to destroy what they saw as divine work. Adult men armed themselves with hunting rifles, axes, and farm tools. Women gathered the children and retreated toward the meeting house. Judge Harrington would later describe the scene in his report as a tragic collision between conviction and reality. What began as a welfare action became a standoff. Innocent children stood trapped between officials attempting to protect them and parents who genuinely believed they were defending them from harm. For nearly 4 hours, negotiations stalled beneath the fog-shrouded trees. Voices rose. Weapons were raised, then lowered. It was Reverend Harlow, whose accidental discovery had set everything in motion, who ultimately broke the deadlock. Speaking not as an authority figure but as a man of faith, he appealed to their shared language of salvation and mercy. Gradually, most of the community agreed to surrender peacefully. But Ezekiel Blackwood did not. He barricaded himself inside the central meeting house alongside 4 male relatives and 13 children. From within, he refused all orders to emerge. To him, surrender meant abandoning the experiment at its most critical stage. The siege lasted 2 days. During that time, authorities employed psychological pressure rather than force. Letters written by women already removed from the settlement were delivered to the building. In them, mothers begged for the children's release. They pleaded for safety, for a chance at care and understanding beyond the hollow. On the morning of May 10, the standoff ended abruptly. Blackwood collapsed inside the meeting house, struck by what physicians later identified as a severe cardiac event. Without their leader's voice, the remaining men surrendered. The children were carried out one by one, confused, frightened, and many visibly impaired. Medical examinations began almost immediately. Dr. Eleanor Phillips, one of the examining physicians, documented findings that would later shape early genetic counseling practices. Of the 31 children evaluated, 27 displayed characteristics consistent with recessive genetic disorders. 18 showed significant developmental delays. 12 suffered skeletal malformations requiring urgent intervention. 9 exhibited serious vision or hearing impairments. Most heartbreaking were the 7 individuals housed in the waiting house. Older children and young adults whose conditions were so severe they required constant care. Their isolation had not been medical necessity, it had been ritualized neglect. The adults presented a far more complex challenge. Many had been born into Blackwood Hollow, indoctrinated from infancy. They knew no alternative framework for family, health, or morality. Others, however, had joined willingly over the years, drawn by Blackwood's charisma and his promise of belonging and purpose. The legal system now faced a question that would reverberate far beyond Kentucky: how to balance religious freedom against demonstrable harm. Ezekiel Blackwood and 6 senior members of the settlement were charged with multiple counts of child endangerment and criminal negligence. To avoid local bias, the trial was moved to Frankfort. Proceedings began on September 15, 1909, and would stretch across 11 tense days. Court transcripts reveal a calculated strategy by the prosecution. Rather than attack belief systems directly, they focused on evidence. Photographs. Medical testimony. Documentation linking the children's conditions directly to repeated consanguineous pairings. The defense argued parental rights. Religious liberty. The autonomy of isolated communities. But these arguments faltered under the weight of physical proof. After just 7 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all major counts. Judge Randolph sentenced Ezekiel Blackwood to 20 years in prison. He would serve less than 3 months, dying of heart failure before the winter's end. Yet the dismantling of Blackwood Hollow marked only the beginning of another ordeal. Authorities now faced an unprecedented responsibility. What would become of 73 individuals raised entirely outside modern society? How would children who had never seen a town, attended school, or encountered outsiders adapt to an unfamiliar world? To address this, the Kentucky Board of Charitable Organizations established a specialized facility near Lexington. Named Pine Ridge Recovery Home, it became one of the first institutions in the country designed to care for individuals emerging from extreme isolation. Dr. James Morrison, appointed director, outlined the challenge plainly in his 1911 report to the legislature. These individuals require more than treatment, he wrote. They require relearning of society, of self, and of truth. They must come to understand that their suffering is not sacred, but preventable. The process was slow and painful. Adults struggled most. Basic social norms, conversation, privacy, trust, were foreign concepts. Many clung to Blackwood's teachings, even after his death. Children adapted more quickly, but carried emotional scars from their sudden separation from everything they had known. One voice from this period stands out. Sarah Blackwood, Ezekiel's granddaughter, kept a journal throughout her stay at Pine Ridge. Her words reveal the quiet devastation left behind when belief collapses under truth. "They tell us grandfather was wrong," she wrote. "They show us drawings of what they call disorders. They say this is why my brother Daniel cannot walk. But if grandfather saw this, why did he continue? I cannot live with either answer." By 1912, the dismantling of Blackwood Hollow was complete, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. The younger children were gradually placed with foster families across Kentucky and neighboring states. Many were taken in by couples unable to have children of their own, families willing to shoulder both the emotional weight and the ongoing medical demands these placements required. Older children and adults whose impairments were less severe were enrolled in vocational programs. Carpentry, sewing, cooking. Skills chosen not for ambition, but for survival. Independence, even partial, was seen as a victory. For others, there would be no such path. The 7 individuals once confined to the waiting house remained institutionalized for the rest of their lives. Though their living conditions improved dramatically, clean facilities, medical supervision, humane care, their futures were irrevocably narrowed by choices made long before they could understand them. The Blackwood case did not fade quietly into history. In legal circles, it became a landmark. Blackwood versus Commonwealth of Kentucky established precedent limiting claims of religious freedom when practices resulted in measurable physical harm to children. Courts across the country would later reference the ruling when confronting similar conflicts between belief and welfare. In medicine, the impact was equally profound. The detailed record seized from Blackwood Hollow offered early researchers a grim but invaluable data set. Physicians and scientists studying heredity, still a young and uncertain field, found in those ledgers clear evidence of how repeated close-kin pairings amplified harmful recessive traits. Professor Harold Jenkins of Harvard Medical School undertook a 30-year follow-up study of the 24 children placed with foster families. His findings, published in 1939, painted a complex picture. Many had adapted remarkably, forming relationships, holding jobs, and participating in society far beyond what early assessments predicted. Yet physical limitations and cognitive challenges persisted. Most striking was a single shared outcome: none had reproduced. Whether due to medical infertility, social choice, or conscious rejection of their ancestry, the genetic lines Ezekiel Blackwood sought to perfect quietly ended. Perhaps the most unexpected legacy emerged from within the family itself. Thomas Blackwood, Ezekiel's grandson, had been 17 when the settlement collapsed. Like many others, he bore visible markers of his grandfather's ideology. Joined fingers. Impaired vision. A body shaped by decisions made before his birth. But Thomas did something no one anticipated. He left Kentucky. Changed his name to Thomas Black. And, against every expectation, pursued medicine. Specializing in what would later be called genetic counseling, he devoted his career to educating rural communities about the dangers of consanguinity. In his 1957 memoir, The Burden of Blood, he wrote with stark honesty, "I live with the evidence of my grandfather's vision every day. My hands, my eyes, reminders I cannot escape. But if this legacy can be transformed into warning rather than prophecy, then perhaps some good may yet emerge from it." The historical weight of Blackwood Hollow extends beyond individual suffering. It represents a critical moment in America's uneasy transition from superstition to science. When Ezekiel Blackwood began his experiment in 1873, the science of genetics barely existed. Gregor Mendel's work on inheritance in pea plants had been published, but remained largely ignored until decades later. Its implications for human biology would not be widely understood until the 20th century. Blackwood operated in this vacuum. With only his Civil War medical experience and personal observations, he constructed theories rooted in analogy rather than evidence. He believed similarity intensified virtue. That like strengthened like. That combining shared blood would magnify desirable traits while erasing weakness. His ritualized blood exchanges, scientifically meaningless, served a more powerful function. They normalized the unthinkable. Wrapped harmful practices in ceremony, transforming violation into tradition. Dr. Margaret Williams, in her 1988 historical analysis, described the case as a collision point between emerging science and entrenched myth. She noted that Blackwood Hollow may represent one of the last large-scale, organized expressions of ancient misconceptions about blood, purity, and heredity. By the 1920s, knowledge derived in part from studying cases like Blackwood Hollow informed new state laws prohibiting marriage between close relatives, statutes that remain in effect today. The physical site of the settlement itself was deliberately erased. After the community's dissolution, the land was purchased by the state and allowed to return to wilderness. Cabins were dismantled. Materials removed. Trails left to disappear beneath undergrowth. Officials feared the location might attract curiosity seekers, or worse, those sympathetic to Blackwood's philosophy. Only a single plaque, installed in 1989 by the Kentucky Historical Society, marks the site. It stands near an unremarkable turnoff on a rural road. Near this location stood Blackwood Hollow. Settlement 1873 to 1909. Site of a tragic chapter in Kentucky history and a formative case in genetic medicine and child welfare law. Yet the human story did not end there. Descendants of those who fled the settlement before 1909 carried the legacy forward in quieter ways. Mary Ellis, great-granddaughter of a woman who escaped Blackwood Hollow in 1891, has spent years connecting with other descendants. There's still so much silence, she explained in a 2018 interview. Some families changed their names and never spoke of it again. Others still believe there was something special in that blood. We help people confront the truth and the emotions that come with it. Medical records show that recessive conditions continue to surface among descendants, though less frequently as family lines merged into the broader population. The Kentucky Department of Public Health now maintains a voluntary registry, offering genetic counseling and specialized care referrals. In 2005, bioethicist Dr. Elizabeth Harper convened a conference at Duke University bringing together historians, physicians, ethicists, and descendants. The goal was not only to study the past, but to understand its relevance. The Blackwood experiment, she concluded, illustrates how misinformation, isolation, and charismatic authority can converge with catastrophic results. These are not relics of the past, they are recurring human vulnerabilities. The story of Blackwood Hollow stands as a warning. Good intentions, when severed from sound science and ethical restraint, can produce suffering on a staggering scale. Isolation breeds certainty. Certainty resists correction. And belief, once hardened into doctrine, can eclipse compassion entirely. These lessons remain painfully relevant. If you've stayed with this story to its end, it's because you understand the importance of confronting history's darkest corners. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end." Your engagement helps keep these stories alive and ensures they are never repeated. Subscribe for more hidden chapters of American history. Like this video, share it with others who value thoughtful, unflinching examinations of our past.